A $4 billion wall of concrete now rises across the Blue Nile, and with it, a new chapter in Africa's story. Ethiopia has completed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the largest hydropower project on the continent, a project so vast that it promises to light millions of homes, and yet so controversial that it has unsettled the balance of nations downstream. How did a landlocked country, long counted among the poorest, achieve what few believed possible? And why does this single dam strike fear in Cairo and pride in Addis Ababa? This is not just about electricity. It is about sovereignty. It is about dignity. It is about a people who chose to fund their future with their own hands when the world doubted them. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is a monument to endurance. 14 years of struggle, sacrifice, and defiance against both internal hardship and external pressure. Stay with us. What comes next is more than a headline. It is a turning point Africa will remember. Subscribe and walk with us through this journey, because the story of this dam is not only Ethiopia's, it is a story of Africa's rising voice, and a question that may decide its future. The year was 2011 when Ethiopia laid the first stone on the banks of the Blue Nile. It was not just a foundation for concrete, it was a foundation for belief. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was announced as a $4 billion undertaking, a scale so immense that skeptics across the globe dismissed it as a fantasy. Ethiopia, they said, lacked the money, the expertise, the infrastructure. But Ethiopia answered not with loans from foreign capitals, but with coins from its own people. Teachers gave from their salaries. Farmers living hand-to-mouth offered what they could. Business owners and civil servants purchased government bonds, not for profit, but as an act of duty. Diaspora Ethiopians sent home remittances, not merely for family, but for a collective dream. Never before had a project of such magnitude in Africa been financed in such a way. This was not foreign aid wrapped in conditions. It was not charity disguised as partnership. This was sacrifice turned into sovereignty. From the moment the first bulldozers arrived, the challenge was not only financial, but also technical. Ethiopia had never attempted anything of this scale. To build a 145-meter-high, 1.8-kilometer-long structure across one of the most strategic rivers in the world required skills that had to be learned on the job. Roads had to be carved out of rugged land. Machinery had to be transported across inhospitable terrain. International contractors joined Ethiopian engineers, many of whom were trained through trial and error, creating a new generation of experts who are themselves part of the dam's living legacy. As the dam rose, so too did the expectations of a nation. Ethiopia had long endured blackouts that crippled its industries, schools, and hospitals. The dream was not only to provide light for its citizens, but to become a net exporter of electricity, feeding power to Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, and beyond. With a design capacity of 6,450 megawatts from 11 turbines, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam promised to more than double Ethiopia's energy supply. It was as if a seed planted in the soil of the Nile had grown into a tree that could cast shade across the continent. But this was never just about engineering. The dam became a movement. Entire villages were relocated to make way for the swelling reservoir, sparking debates about compensation and fairness. Thousands of workers lived in camps for years, separated from their families, enduring isolation and harsh conditions. These sacrifices rarely made headlines, but they are etched into the story as deeply as the concrete walls themselves. When the first turbines began spinning, it was more than a technical milestone. It was a declaration. Ethiopia had proven that even without the deep pockets of global financial institutions, even without bending to the dictates of external powers, a nation could seize control of its own development path. The hum of the turbines was not just electricity flowing into the grid. It was dignity flowing into the veins of a country long denied the right to shape its own future. And yet behind the celebration, shadows stretched downstream. Egypt and Sudan, nations tied to the Nile as lifeblood, began to see not progress but peril. They raised questions about water, about rights, about survival itself. But the dam was never just about electricity. It was about power of another kind. From the moment the dam's concrete spine began to rise above the Blue Nile, Ethiopia's neighbors felt the tremors, not of the earth, but of politics. For Egypt, the Nile has always been more than water. It is the artery of life itself. Over 90% of Egypt's fresh water comes from this river. For centuries, treaties dating back to colonial rule enshrined Egypt's dominance, granting it near total control over the flow. When Ethiopia announced it would build a structure capable of storing 74 billion cubic meters, Cairo saw not a dam, but a dagger aimed at its heart. The rhetoric from Egypt grew sharper as the reservoir grew deeper. Successive governments in Cairo painted the project as an existential threat. Statements in parliament and fiery speeches on television spoke of survival, of red lines, of all options being on the table. Military officials issued veiled warnings and analysts began to speculate about the unthinkable, a military confrontation over water. For Ethiopia, each turbine installed was not only a triumph of engineering, but also an act of defiance against external pressure. The struggle was never about concrete alone. It was about sovereignty contested in full view of the world. Sudan's reaction was more complex, layered with both promise and peril. On one hand, cheaper electricity and regulated water flow promised tangible benefits. Floods that once destroyed farmland could be controlled. Energy shortages that hampered growth could be alleviated. Yet Sudanese officials also voiced fears that Ethiopia might operate the dam in ways that endangered their own dams and irrigation systems. The debate in Khartoum swayed back and forth, torn between optimism and apprehension, between partnership and mistrust. Inside Ethiopia, the sacrifices mounted. Workers toiled through searing heat and monsoon rains, often cut off from their families for months on end. Communities displaced by the expanding reservoir spoke of promises of compensation that came too late or not at all. For them, the dam was both pride and pain, a symbol of national destiny, but also a reminder of personal loss. The media celebrated the grandeur of the turbines, but rarely lingered on the faces of farmers forced to leave ancestral soil behind. Internationally, reactions were equally divided. Some hailed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam as proof of what African nations could achieve when they funded and built their own projects without bending to outside dictates. They saw in the dam a spark of a new era, a declaration that Africa would no longer be shaped solely by foreign powers. Others, however, warned of the dangers of unmanaged transboundary resources. They spoke of flashpoints, of miscalculations that could spiral into conflict. For world powers like the United States, the European Union, and the African Union, the challenge became one of diplomacy, keeping tensions from spilling over, while respecting Ethiopia's right to develop. But in Addis Ababa, the mood was defiant. Officials repeated that the dam was a project of peace and development, not a weapon of war. They argued that regulating the river would benefit everyone, stabilizing water flow, reducing the extremes of flood and drought, and offering a reliable source of energy for the region. They framed the project not as a zero-sum game, but as a collective step toward regional stability. Yet the mistrust ran deep, and each new stage of construction seemed to harden positions rather than soften them. The dam became a stage where emotion and strategy collided. To the Ethiopian public, it was a monument to resilience. To Egypt, it was a challenge to survival. To Sudan, it was a gamble between gain and risk. And to the wider world, it was a case study in how development, diplomacy, and destiny intertwine in the 21st century. The turbines began to spin, but so too did the narratives. Was this the dawn of African self-reliance, or the prelude to new conflict? Yet even as concrete rose, so did the flames of regional tension. When the first surge of electricity from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam flowed into Ethiopia's national grid, it was more than a flick of a switch. For millions, it was the first taste of reliable light. Factories that had once fallen silent in the midst of blackouts began to hum with new rhythm. Schools and hospitals, long hampered by power cuts, could finally plan without fear of darkness. The transformation was immediate and symbolic. Ethiopia had for decades been shackled by an energy deficit. Diesel generators were costly, fuel imports strained budgets, and whole industries stagnated under the weight of uncertainty. With 6 turbines already operational and more to come, the country's energy supply more than doubled. Suddenly, the dream of exporting power became tangible reality. Contracts with Sudan, Kenya, and Djibouti stood ready, and Ethiopia positioned itself as an energy hub for East Africa. Electricity became not just a domestic utility, but a regional currency, traded across borders, binding economies together. The social consequences were profound. A nation that had poured its wages, savings, and sacrifices into a single project could finally see dividends. For the farmers who gave from their harvests, for the teachers who surrendered a slice of their salary, for the diaspora who bought bonds not for profit but for patriotism, the glow of light bulbs across Ethiopia was a vindication. This was a project funded not by outsiders but by Ethiopians themselves. and its benefits touched every layer of society. But not all consequences were celebratory. Entire communities had been uprooted to clear land for the vast reservoir, one of the largest in Africa. Villages vanished beneath rising waters, families forced to start again on unfamiliar soil. Promises of compensation were uneven, sometimes delayed, sometimes disputed. For those displaced, the dam stood as both pride and wound, a national triumph shadowed by personal loss. Environmental questions also loomed large. By altering sediment flow downstream, the dam risked reducing soil fertility in Sudan and Egypt, threatening the delicate balance of agriculture that had endured for centuries. Politically, the dam reinforced Ethiopia's narrative of sovereignty. Each turbine that spun was a statement. That development need not be dictated by external creditors. That dignity could be built brick by brick, funded by citizens' calloused hands. This sense of autonomy resonated beyond Ethiopia's borders. In West Africa, Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traoré, embodied a similar spirit, challenging dependency and urging self-reliance. Just as Ethiopia refused to bow to external pressure in building its dam, Traoré rejected old economic chains in shaping his nation's destiny. It was no coincidence that many began to speak of a continental awakening, a slow but certain shift from aid to agency. Yet sovereignty came with new tensions at home. Within Ethiopia, debates raged over how the revenues from electricity exports should be distributed. Would the wealth trickle down to rural farmers, or pool in the hands of elites in Addis Ababa? Would the political fractures that had long haunted the country deepen or heal under the glow of new power lines? Sovereignty alone was not enough. Justice in distribution would determine whether the dam truly became a beacon of national unity or another chapter of inequality. On the streets of Addis, in the farms of Oromia, in the diaspora communities across the globe, the dam became a constant reference point. It was talked about as both miracle and burden, a source of pride and a reminder of sacrifice. Citizens felt ownership over it in a way rare for such mega projects, because they had paid for it with their own pockets. The dam had turned from an engineering feat into a social contract, binding the government and its people in shared achievement, in shared expectation. And so Ethiopia's greatest project was not simply about water and electricity. It was about rewriting the relationship between state, citizen, and continent. The question was no longer whether the lights would stay on, but whether the glow could illuminate a fairer, stronger future for all. But if the lights turn on in Ethiopia, what shadows fall elsewhere? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not just a wall of concrete on the Blue Nile. It is a fault line running through the heart of international diplomacy. From Addis Ababa to Cairo, from Brussels to Washington, the project has forced governments and institutions to ask, who controls Africa's resources and on whose terms? The African Union has stepped in repeatedly, seeking to mediate between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. High-level summits in Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, and Khartoum have produced statements of goodwill but little binding agreement. For the AU, the dam is both a test and an opportunity, a chance to prove that African disputes can be resolved on African soil without outside arbitration. Yet the task has proven daunting, for the Nile is not only a river of water, but of power. Regional organizations like ECOWAS and the East African Community have watched closely. For them, Ethiopia's ability to generate surplus energy holds promise of integration through the Eastern Africa Power Pool, a project that could tie national grids together and stabilize the region's energy future. But they also recognize the risk. If tensions harden, the dream of continental cooperation could be drowned by mistrust. Beyond Africa, the European Union has expressed both concern and cautious support. Brussels sees the dam as a potential driver of green energy, aligned with global climate goals, but also as a flashpoint that could destabilize a fragile region already marked by conflict and migration pressures. The United States has at times weighed in, urging compromise, though critics note that Washington's position often appears tilted towards Egypt, a longtime ally. China, heavily invested in African infrastructure, has stayed largely in the background, watching how a domestically funded project might challenge its traditional role as financier. Amid these shifting stances, one theme resonates: sovereignty. For Ethiopia, the dam is proof that development can be homegrown. For other African nations, it is a signal that dependency is not destiny. That same spirit has found echo in the Burkina Faso revolution under Ibrahim Traoré, where policies prioritizing self-reliance over external dictates mirror Ethiopia's defiance. Together, these movements suggest that a continent long bound by external conditions may be charting a new course. But such independence is rarely welcomed by those who benefit from the old order. The global debate over the Nile reflects not only fears of water scarcity, but anxieties about a new African agency. As turbines spin, so too does the question, will international diplomacy adapt to this reality or attempt to resist it? The question is no longer about one dam. It is about an entire continent's direction. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam now stands complete, but its story is only beginning. With turbines spinning and electricity flowing, Ethiopia faces a future filled with both promise and peril. The question is not simply what the dam produces, but what direction it sets for an entire region. On one path lies opportunity. Ethiopia can become the energy hub of East Africa, exporting power to neighbors, driving industrial growth, and anchoring a regional network of trade and integration. Reliable electricity could transform factories, farms, and households, lifting millions out of poverty and opening new doors of opportunity. For a nation long defined by hardship, the dam offers the chance to write a new chapter of prosperity. Yet on the other path lies risk. If mismanaged, the reservoir could become a source of endless dispute. Diplomatic mistrust with Egypt and Sudan may flare again, each negotiation turning into confrontation. Environmental consequences, from soil fertility to biodiversity, demand constant vigilance. And within Ethiopia itself, questions remain about whether the benefits will reach all citizens or concentrate in the hands of a few. Sovereignty has been claimed, but justice in its exercise must be earned. For Africa as a whole, the dam is more than an Ethiopian achievement. It is a symbol of possibility. Just as a seed planted in harsh soil can grow into a tree, GERD has shown that vision, sacrifice, and determination can defy doubt. It echoes across the continent, from Addis Ababa to Ouagadougou, where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré speak of dignity, independence, and self-reliance. The future of Africa may well depend on whether nations choose to walk this road together, building alliances rooted not in dependency, but in partnership. The dam teaches that sovereignty is never free. It is bought with sacrifice, with courage, with the willingness to endure storms and stand firm. Ethiopia has lit a beacon. The challenge now is whether others will follow its light, or whether shadows of mistrust will dim its glow. But will Africa walk this new road together, or stumble alone? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is now complete, a monument of steel and stone, but also of belief and defiance. For Ethiopia, it is the end of one struggle and the beginning of another. The turbines roar not only with electricity, but with meaning, a declaration that sovereignty is not granted, it is taken. This dam is a mirror of Africa's long journey. It reflects the pain of displacement, the sweat of laborers, the determination of citizens who gave their salaries and savings for a dream. It carries the weight of diplomacy and the burden of mistrust, but also the glow of hope, that a continent long defined by dependency might carve a different destiny. Ethiopia has proved that a nation can build without bending, that sacrifice can become sovereignty. Across the continent, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré speaks with the same defiant spirit, rejecting dependency, demanding dignity, and placing faith in the strength of his people. His vision, alongside Ethiopia's dam, feeds into a wider awakening, a recognition that Africa's resources, its hands, its future, must no longer be controlled from outside. But the question is larger than one leader or one project. Can Africa turn these sparks into a fire of transformation? Can the unity of nations overcome the weight of history? If one small landlocked country can defy the odds, what stops the rest? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has already changed the map of power on the Nile, but its greatest legacy may be the example it sets, that African sovereignty is possible, that dignity is not a dream, that independence is not a relic of the past, but the foundation of the future. This is the story of Ethiopia, yes, but it is also the story of Africa rising, one turbine, one leader, one revolution at a time. If the story of GERD moves you, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and keep walking with us. The journey of African sovereignty has only begun.